Something about this story doesn't add up. The United States spent years negotiating a new trade agreement for North America. It promoted it as a stronger replacement for NAFTA, signed it into law in 2020, and described it as an agreement built for the future. Yet only a few years later, that same agreement is under review and Washington is signaling it wants more than a routine renewal. Countries don't normally revisit agreements they fought to create only a few years earlier. And that alone makes this worth paying attention to. Now, to understand why, we first need to understand what USMCA actually is. Most people think it's simply a trade agreement, but it's not. USMCA is the economic framework that governs how Canada, the United States, and Mexico do business with one another. It sets the rules for everything from manufacturing and architecture to digital commerce, intellectual property, and investment. More importantly, it gives businesses confidence that the economic relationship between three countries will remain predictable enough to justify investments that can take decades to pay off. Now, in many ways, USMCA functions like the operating manual for the North American economy. Millions of businesses don't read it, but they rely on it every day. And when it came into force in 2020, the objective was straightforward: modernize a trade agreement that was nearly 3 decades old, encourage more manufacturing within North America, and strengthen the region's ability to compete globally. Then the world refused to cooperate. You see, the pandemic exposed just how vulnerable global manufacturing had become. Companies that had spent decades building highly efficient supply chains suddenly found themselves unable to get the parts they needed. Production slowed, inventories disappeared, and efficiency no longer looked quite as resilient as it once had. And before governments had fully absorbed those lessons, another challenge emerged. The relationship the United States and China had became increasingly defined by strategic competition rather than economic cooperation. And policymakers were no longer asking only where products could be manufactured most efficiently. They also had to consider where those products should be manufactured and whether dependence on geopolitical rivals had become a strategic risk. Then came artificial intelligence. Almost overnight, the race wasn't simply about software or algorithms. It became a race for data centers, electricity, advanced computing infrastructure, and the materials needed to build it all. Economic policy suddenly became intertwined with technology policy in ways that barely entered the conversation when the USMCA was actually negotiated. So by this point, the conversation surrounding North America trade looked very different than it had just a few years earlier. The agreement hadn't changed. The environment around it had. And that brings us back to today. The current review isn't happening in the same world that existed when USMCA was signed. It is taking place after a pandemic, during an AI investment boom, amid heightened geopolitical competition, and at a time when governments are placing greater emphasis on where critical industries are located and who controls them. So whether that leads to modest adjustments or something far more significant remains to be seen. But there is another part of this story that often gets overlooked. Many people assume that if the United States doesn't agree to extend the USMCA, the agreement just simply disappears. It doesn't. The review process and the withdrawal process are two different things. If the review ends without an extension, USMCA doesn't just immediately expire. Instead, the agreement can continue while the three countries conduct annual reviews unless one of the parties formally withdraws under a separate provision. That distinction matters because markets don't wait for legal deadlines. Businesses begin evaluating uncertainty long before policies change, especially when major investments are expected to operate for decades. For investors, that's where this story becomes interesting. Not because the future of USMCA will be decided tomorrow, but because the review offers something much more valuable than a political headline. It offers a glimpse into how the United States is thinking about the next chapter of the North American economy. And that's the real story here. The agreement itself may ultimately survive with only modest changes, or it could evolve in meaningful ways. Either outcome matters. What matters even more here is understanding why this conversation is happening now. Because when the priorities of the world's largest economy begin to shift, the effects rarely stop at just one agreement. They ripple across industries, capital markets, and investment decisions for years to come. So as North America heads into what could become one of the most consequential trade negotiations in a generation, The biggest story may not be what ends up on the negotiating table. It may be what those negotiations reveal about where the United States believes the future of economic power, manufacturing, and global competitiveness is headed. And if history has taught investors anything here, it's that the biggest opportunities rarely appear after the negotiations are over. They emerge while the world is still trying to understand what comes next. I'm Lindsay Melchick, and this has been your Market Knowledge.